Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the channel if this is your first time. This is a video where I'm going to talk about Ice by Anna Kavan. Okay, so this was recently republished by Penguin. There was a spate of them that came out a few years ago, which included two Robert Sheckley books actually. And these are like rediscovered classics. And I bought it quite a while ago now, and it's been on my TBR for quite a while, and I've mentioned it recently when I talked about some vintage books I wanted to read, and vintage science fiction books I wanted to read. And then the opportunity came up to include this in a book challenge because Ben reads good. Check out his channel. He started a challenge for this year. Well, actually, it's a repeat of last year, but second year of him doing it, which is the Read Good Challenge. And January, he nicknamed Annuary, and the challenge in January is to read a book written by an Anne. So it could be anyone. And initially, I was thinking about Anne Rice, and I was thinking about Anna Newitz, and who's the other one? Anna Leckie, and I went with Anna Kavan and Ice because this is something I've been wanting to read anyway. And I tell you what, it's one of the most complicated, layered, potentially allegorical, depending on how you want to interpret it, and sophisticated books I've read in a long, long time. And it's deeply troubling, it's dark, it's brutal, it's very bleak, it's kind of relentless, there's not a lot of humour in it. And this darkness that pervades through the whole book is consistent, and I think it reflects her state of mind, which I'll get to later on. So it came out in 1967, which was a year before she died, and it did have initial success. So she did get to feel, apparently, some of that success before she died. But she literally died the year later. So 1967 it came out. And science fiction had already gone into a new phase. I think in those days, and possibly now, this kind of science fiction is often labelled by the authors and by publishers as speculative fiction, because this is ultimately literary fiction. It's got beautiful prose in it, and sometimes when you get that in science fiction, some of the authors would rather be called speculative authors than science fiction authors. So that is often a word that gets put with these kinds of books. But I'll get to the prose in a moment. But I'm just going to talk about the three main threads running through this book first, to give you an idea of the plot. It's a short book, and it packs so much into it. So, referencing the title, there's one sort of cataclysmic climate environmental thing that's happening through the book, that's creeping through the book. It's spoken right at the beginning, but it gets worse and worse and worse, so that basically the world is turning to ice. There's snow everywhere, and there's lots of huge ice sheets, ice shields that are kind of coming across and enveloping different areas. But there's a sense that there's another ice age coming, basically, and that the world is going to be encased in ice and snow by the end of the book, possibly. If you're reading, if you kind of feel like that, it doesn't quite happen, but that's the feeling through the book, and it's happening through the book. So that's one of the threads that is utterly relentless through the whole thing. There's also an unnamed war happening, and it's worth saying that the countries aren't named as well. So the countries that are in these wars are not named. The characters aren't named as well, which I'll get to in a second. But yeah, there's this war that's building up, and sometimes that becomes a really big part of the narrative, and sometimes there's really specific things that are happening that are connections to this war. But that's also happening, and I think it's this sense that the world's falling apart, really, and you've got this sense of nuclear Armageddon, but also authority is broken apart. You've got these warring factions, and you've got the sort of chaos on the ground while this environmental cataclysm is happening as well. So that's the second thing. And then the other thing, which is really the main drive of the book, because those two things are like the background, is this unnamed first-person narrator is pursuing a woman. One woman relentlessly. The drive of this character through the whole book is to hunt down and basically possess, really, this woman. And it's a woman that he meets. Well, it's a woman that he's had a vague relationship with in the early days. It doesn't really say exactly what the relationship was like, but there's a sense of the first meeting in early on in the book, and he keeps looking for her, finding her, and whenever, and up until the end, which is a lot more complicated, but every time he meets her, she sort of bulks away from him, and there's this sense that she's frightened of him, and I'm going to get to what I think that's about later on in the video, because I'm kind of trying to be relatively vague for the start, and if when I start saying what I think the book means, you might want to turn off then. I don't know, sort of read it yourself, but that's a really massive drive in the book, and something that I wasn't expecting, because I knew about the ice thing, but I didn't know about the main drive of the book, which was this unnamed first-person narrator who's pursuing her. And this book has got three characters, really. There's not a lot of characters outside the three main characters. So it's this woman, this blonde woman, like bleached blonde woman, who's kind of like it's described sometimes as a waif, and the glass woman by him sometimes. So there's this sort of seemingly frail, but I think the idea is that she's very beautiful as well, waif-like blonde woman. So that's one of the characters, who's the one that's like relentlessly pursued. And there's the unnamed first-person narrator, and then there's a character called the Warden. And the Warden is a funny one, because the Warden is more brutal than the narrator, quite aggressive and sharp, and like an antagonist to the first-person narrator's protagonist. So a little bit of an opposite in some ways. But there's also this strange way that Anna Kavan alludes to the idea that the Warden and the narrator are the same person. And it happens a few times in the book, but it also has bits in the book which would contradict that as well, which is something I'm going to get to now, which is the sense of reality in the book. So one of the things that makes this book really complicated is that there's this unreliable narrator at the centre of it, and there's also just moments where the reality just shifts and it doesn't seem real. So that's mostly the first half of the book. It kind of settles down a little bit, and there's less of that in the second half. But I don't know, you could even at one point I did wonder whether the whole cataclysmic Ice Age thing was also in the first person narrator's mind. But then I started thinking, oh, this book is just making you question everything. So the sense of reality being shifted is a really important part of that as well. So the fact is unreliable narrator, and the fact that his pursuit seems to be guided by different things. The narrator's personality is really flexible, kind of changes. Sometimes he's really aggressive. Sometimes he sounds like he cares for her. Sometimes he just wants to control her. Sometimes he wants to abuse her. There's some lines in it that are really odd, like the pleasure in seeing her hurt, or the pleasure in hurting her, and that kind of thing. So that's in there as well. But this relationship with the Warden's odd. Sometimes once you get that idea in your head, once she alludes to it, that's it. It's in your head. You think, oh, are they the same person? And then you start seeing some sort of references to things that would back that up, and then you see other things and you just think, well, that wouldn't make sense. But then maybe it doesn't make sense because it's not real. So that's the thing. So I just want to say, before I talk a little bit more about the the sort of meaning behind the book, and I'm going to read some of the text, I just want to say that the prose is fantastic in this book. So it is quite a challenging book in its sense of reality and what you think it might all mean, and I think people get different things from the book. So I think that's an interesting thing that makes it much more of a challenge to the reader, because they can't just, it's not just sort of there in front of you. You are going, well, what does this bit mean? And is this bit real and all that? So I think that's one aspect of it. But despite that, it's not a mess, because the way it's written is beautifully written, and the prose is just so the way that the environment is described is really, really vivid. The way that the characters' emotions are put across are really vivid. And that sense that even though some of it seems a bit unreal, the drive is really clear. And each time it does shift, the shift is clear, even if you're thinking, where did this come from? So the prose is brilliantly written. It's brilliantly written, but it is just beware, just be aware of that you're going in for a twisted, dark, relentless journey if you're going to read this. So, interpretation. I'll just say now that Anna Kavan lived quite a complicated and painful life, and she ended up being addicted to heroin for most of her life. She was also in and out of mental health institutions as well for depression. And I think those two things ended up colouring what I thought the book might be about. By the time I got to the last third of the book, I started thinking about that, because I found that about her anyway, but I wasn't letting that interfere with how I felt about the book. But that started creeping into my idea of what the book might be about, because I started thinking, and I genuinely haven't seen anybody else say this, so it could be me being completely mad, but I started thinking that the man's pursuit of the woman, who is described in a way that kind of looks like Anna Kavan, I was wondering if she was trying to work through the idea that heroin and drug addiction was pursuing her, and that she couldn't escape the need to take the drugs, and that because there's a moment where sometimes she's expecting abuse, and she covers her body. She doesn't want to be anywhere near him, and when he appears, she bolts away. But then there's other times when she's waiting for him, and it's not something that's built around fear, and that addict relationship. I don't know. Sometimes I wondered if that was what was going on there, and then I also thought, well, maybe all the cataclysmic stuff about the ice enveloping the world could be a metaphor for her depression, and the fact that she can't get out of that, and it's this wall that's built around her. So I don't know, but that's the point, really, that you can take this in so many different ways, and it's so clever, and it's really complicated, but it is dark, and it's relentless, and it might be short, but it is quite a ride. So there we are. So that's Anna Kavan's Ice. But I just wanted to illustrate some of the beautiful ways that she writes the text by reading some of it. So I need to get my glasses. So this bit here is really about the cataclysmic sense of the ice approaching and enveloping more and more of the land. There were no clouds. I saw islands scattered over the sea, a normal aerial view. Then something extraordinary out of this world, a wall of rainbow ice jutting up from the sea, cutting right across, pushing a ridge of water ahead of it as it moved, as if the flat, pale surface of sea was a carpet being rolled up. It was a sinister, fascinating sight, which did not seem intended for human eyes. I stared down at it, seeing other things at the same time. The ice world spreading over our world, mountainous walls of ice surrounding the girl, her moon-white skin, her hair sparkling with diamond prisms under the moon's dead eye watching the death of our world. And there's another line later on another page where it says it's a defenseless earth. Sorry, the defenseless earth could only lie waiting for its own destruction. And for me, that was what made me start thinking about this idea that could be a reference to depression, and that idea you can't, it's so hard to get out of it if you get into that kind of thing. Okay, so one last section. The day got colder as it went on. The sky darkened. Rising beyond the mountains behind me, ominous masses of black cloud were converging upon the sea. I watched these clouds, understood their meaning, felt the intensifying cold with increasing dread. I knew it meant only one thing. The glaciers were closing in. Instead of my world, there would soon be only ice, snow, stillness, death. No more violence, no war, no victims, nothing but frozen silence, absence of life. The ultimate achievement of mankind would be not just self-destruction, but the destruction of all life, the transformation of the living world into a dead planet. In a sky which should have been cloudless and burning blue, the sombre, enormous structures of storm cloud looked inexpressibly sinister, threatening, like monstrous ruins on the point of collapse, hanging possibly overhead. Icy, crystalline shapes began to flower on the windscreen. I was oppressed by the sense of universal strangeness, by the chill of approaching catastrophe, the menace of ruins suspended above, and also by the enormity of what had been done, the weight of collective guilt. A frightful crime had been committed against nature, against the universe, against life. By rejecting life, man had destroyed the immemorial order, destroyed the world, and now everything was about to crash down in ruins. So, I think hopefully you can get a sense of how brilliantly she writes, but when you do read it, I think you might be reading a very different interpretation of the book as somebody else, because it's so open and it's such an interesting, fascinating and troubling, disturbing book. Thanks a lot for watching. Stay curious, everybody.